Hi everyone and welcome back. This is part 2 of painting white fur with our little friend Dex. And we left off working on the ear in the last video, so that's pretty much done. And now I'm just starting to work on the bridge of the nose, just putting white all over those hairs, just emphasizing the hairs in that section. And if you note, they will be darker closer towards the nose. There's more shadowed areas closer towards the nose, and the hairs will be brighter as we go up towards the eye. So I want to make sure and try and keep that. That way it gives definition and shape to the whole nose area. If I just made it all pure white and had no other colors and no shading between the nose and the hairs, it would just all look completely flat. So we don't want that. We want to make sure we keep some of the shadow just where that hairline and the nose meet. Those shadows you see are underneath the hair, and as well some parts of the color of the muzzle. The skin under that hair is darker, so you will see some darker areas under the fur. By using this blue pencil here, we're also creating depth, which is important, and all of that together will help give us shape to the nose and the hairs on top of the nose, the whole muzzle part, and the gray as well. Just making little lines, trying to define everything, creating those little details that bring a whole piece to life. Always looking back at my reference photo, making sure that I'm doing or trying to reproduce as closely as possible what I'm seeing on my monitor. And here I have my dark gray pencil. I'm just going to outline the shape of the nose a little bit just so I don't lose it. And I'm using a blending stump just to try and pull some of that darker color. And this will help to not only define our nose, but it'll help us give us little shadow areas and little lines in between the hairs that'll define those hairs. So just using that to gently blend it out. One thing I must say about noses is they're all individual, they're all unique to the dog. They all come in various shapes and colors and with their own little unique features. And I find them to be a very difficult part, and they're just as essential as the eyes in helping to define and to reproduce the dog's character and true likeness in a painting. So pay very close attention to a dog's nose. An owner will know if the nose does not look like their dog, and it will change the whole appearance of the pet, whether that be a dog or a cat or any other animal. That nose is just as crucial as the eyes. So they can be a little tricky. And on the muzzle here, I put down some rust color because he's kind of stained around the nose and the mouth, so I want to put that down. I put a little bit less than in the photo, and I often do that because a lot of people tend to not like all that rust because it's not a natural part of the dog's color. They're actually stains. So I try and lessen it, but by still keeping it there because it is part of the dog essentially. So I just try and tone it down a bit, and I think people appreciate that. I've had one client in the past that was happy because I did not emphasize it, and she was really happy that she just wasn't looking at those stains on her dog's face. So that's up to you. Some clients might want it there, but I still have it. It's just toned down just a little bit at the end. And I've got my white Conte pencil here, just putting some little fine white lines around, just emphasizing. It all looks really bright white on there because of the camera. It's not all that bright. In person, you can really see the definition between each hair. And the various shades, like the gray and the blue as well, and some of the cream. You're not really seeing the cream here, maybe just a tad. You really have to look, but The cream is there. Now I'm going to start outlining the nostrils. The nostrils are difficult, and the shape will change depending on how the light is shining down on the dog. Sometimes a nostril will be more shadowed, so you'll see more of just a little round black hole. And then sometimes the other nostril will be highlighted, and you'll see a bit more of the inside of the nose. And this always, well, not always, but it often feels strange as you're painting it. As you can see here on the left side of the nose on the screen, you could kind of see a little part. So I'm putting that in there, but towards the end it'll be more black, but just a hint of that little inner part of the nose. So it'll sometimes feel strange as you're doing it. It won't feel right, but just keep doing it. And I've got my black and I'm going around, just trying to define the shape of the nose. And you want to be sure you don't make your nose too big. Sometimes going just a tad on the outer edges of your outline can make the nose look way too big. So do be mindful of that. They can be tricky little buggers. And I usually like to start outlining my nose in black and filling them in using a combination of black and dark gray, because there are things I don't want to lose until I put my final touches when I'm finishing the nose. For example, I've already got his little nostrils done in black. If I went ahead and covered the whole inside of that nose in black right away, I'd lose sight of my nostrils, so I don't want that. So for that reason, I put a touch of gray underneath the nostril there. It's a darker gray, but it's still gray, so I could still see the difference between the black nostrils and the rest. And I'm just blending it in with a blending stump right now, just trying to get a little bit more color in there and just push that pastel into the pastel matte. I zoomed it in a little bit closer here, so hopefully you can see better on your monitors at home. And here's my black. I'm trying to pay attention to the reference photo and notice where I see it as blacker on the photo, and just putting in some of the little shadows and darker hairs, or should I say definition between the hairs, because he doesn't have black hairs, it's just definition. And this here is a navy blue pencil, the darkest blue in the Caran d'Ache, and I'm just going over everything with the navy blue. And that's just a base layer for my nose. A lot of times when you look at black, you don't want to just highlighted black will look blue. So don't be afraid to use blue for black if you understand what I'm trying to say. Black will not be just solid black throughout. When the light hits on it in certain areas, it will reflect as blue or mauve or various shades depending on the light. So for this reason, you'll often use blue in your noses. And sometimes other colors, sometimes you'll have some pinkish pigments showing through, or sometimes you'll see the green of grass shining on the nose, reflecting back. So depending on the reflective light, you can have various colors in your nose, and it's a good thing to pay attention. You'll see later I'll put some warm tones on the top of his nose for highlights. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think maybe it was the natural surrounding, the beach that the dog was on, was reflecting a warmer, kind of a beige color on top of his nose. And you'll see that later. And another thing you don't want to lose as you're painting the nose is that little line in the middle. It serves as a good guide between your nostrils, your nose, the center of your nose, the angle of the dog, depending, or the cat, depending on what you're painting and how he's positioned, as well as the mouth. So you'll be using that little middle line as a guide a lot. So just pay attention and be mindful of that. And here I'm just softening that pastel, pushing it around with a blending stump. And here's my black, just going over that nostril again, pushing it in. If you're not used to drawing, learn little tricks like that, like the one I mentioned about that little line inside the middle of his nose. Using guides like that all over your drawing will help you. So I made it darker under the nose because it's more of a shadowed area. There's a slight curvature and it's more shadowed. And here I'm just defining a little bit of the hairs. I don't want to lose the shape of my nose. So I'm going ahead and putting those in right now just to help me. So again, using this as a guide so I don't lose my nose in all this black pastel. And sometimes you might have to adjust this quite a bit as you go along. If you're not happy with the shape, don't be afraid to just go ahead and adjust and fix as you go along. I just marked a little highlight with the blue underneath that nostril where the light is hitting. And I put a darker blue. I'm going to do this as well. And this is also going to help me to not lose my nostrils. I might adjust later on, but at least I know a general idea of the placement as I keep working. Smoothing that out. And here I'm starting to put a little bit of brown, just trying to get a little bit of warmth on there to build up to that point where I said earlier there were some warmer reflections on the top of his nose. Some of the reflective light was a warm tone, almost pinkish. And here we go, I've got that warm taupish color, kind of like a sand color, and I'm just putting the little dots. If you pay very close attention to a dog's anatomy and look closely at the nose, you'll see that his nose is covered in tons of little bumps and dots and grooves, and it's just very interesting patterns. It would take a lot of patience to reproduce these accurately, but just putting little pastel dots, so just gently tapping on your paper and then just gently pushing down with your finger will recreate those nicely. Don't make them too uniform. There's no uniform pattern to these. They're just scattered. So just gently apply some pastel in tiny little circles, and then you could tap down and you can build up on top of that. So you see how the temperature of the color is changing completely on top. It's a much warmer color. And we can start getting a sense of the reflective light now on top of his nose. I'm just going to blend things out with my stump. You might forever be adjusting, well, not forever, but you might continually be adjusting your nostrils as you work on any animal. So that's just, it's part of the deal. As with everything, you constantly adjust as you go along. If it doesn't look right, just try and determine what is it that doesn't feel right or look right, and just make adjustments. If you're not sure, put it aside, walk away, flip your painting upside down, flip it sideways, look at it in the mirror, and if you do these things, you might see what exactly is off about your painting, and that'll help you make adjustments. Or even take a photo and put it side by side on your computer screen and try and shrink them down to the or enlarge them both to the same size and just kind of compare. And just pushing through some of that black to make little lines to give the hair's definition under the nose, because that'll be shadowed as well. This much the same as it was on top, but the shadowed areas will be darker underneath the nose than they are on top. Do you see now though on top of the nose how much it looks like reflected light compared to the rest? I'm still adjusting with that beigeish color. And I will lighten that up later too. Right here, I've got a light blue pencil and I'm going to start adding little highlights. Again, just using tiny little circular motions, just gentle pressure, not too hard, just randomly here and there. And that's starting to add even more light on top of our nose. And even though this is a cool blue, that warmer tone we put underneath will still show through because we're not completely covering it up. And see how just by adding that light blue now, the nose is already shining a little bit more. You could tell that there's a reflection coming up from above, that the light is coming from above and shining down on the dog's nose. And adding those subtle highlights and colors just brings the whole nose to life. I'm just going to blend in and smooth that a little bit. And now that we're pretty much done the nose, I'm going back to the hair around the muzzle and I'm just going to start blocking in again. Just laying down a base color using the light gray pencil. And we still haven't done too much work on that side of the face on the right side of the screen yet. So we will be getting to that part as well. So just pushing that in. Don't want any loose pastel sitting on top. And here's my cream colored Conte again. Just trying to make sure I get those golden tones around the muzzle. And speaking of the golden tones and using this cream colored pencil, if you note the blue that we used around the nose, on the edge of the nose to outline it, it's going to complement the golden tones and the cream tones in the fur really well. While painting any piece, it's important to understand color theory and understand which colors complement each other. Study your color wheel. Maybe that's a lesson we can do in the future as well, just a brief lesson on color theory. But if you can understand color theory, you could create really beautiful paintings. People don't really know why a painting is more pleasing. They just know when they look at it, they love it, and color theory will help you with that. If you note the green of the grass complements the reddish tinge, the reddish browns in the fur. So this is another way that there are complementary colors in this piece. Still making sure to get those little gold tones on top of the nose, on the bridge of the nose. It's just a creamier shade of white. And now I'm going to just make some fine little hairs that overlap on top of the nose. It's important to get those tiny little details in. Dogs often have those little hairs that overlap the nose, so try and pay attention to that on your reference photos. You're not always going to see them, but many times they will be there. And I just use a very gentle, light pressure when I make those little lines. And note how the direction of my hairs are changing as I move around on the muscle. On top of the nose, the hairs grow straight up and then they just start gently curving downwards as we follow the round shape of the muzzle. So be sure to pay attention how the hairs grow and try and duplicate that. Laying down some of the white here just so I don't lose my placement. And I'm going to speed things up just a little bit here because it's rather long to just see one line at a time being put down. But basically what I'm doing is I'm just going around with my pencils, just putting the lines down where needed. And I'm using my brown pencil here again just to define the shadowed areas and the separation between the ear and the face. And I'm using a lighter mid-tone gray as well, just blending those two together. And some white over top, just starting to define the hairs more. And on that side of the face now that we haven't really paid too much attention to yet, now we're just going to start highlighting some of the whiter hairs and just adding more detail on that side of the face. I want to make sure that we can see the different layers of texture in the fur. And by this I mean there are some layers of fur overlapping over each other. So you want to make sure you get that definition in there. And I'm using the white here, the Rembrandt white stick. It's just brighter. I love how bright it is, as I've mentioned before. If you don't like using the full stick like that, if you find it's too blunt and you have a hard time, what I often do is I'll take a little X-Acto knife and I'll break off a tiny piece and I'll use the sharp ends of the pastel stick. And here, just to add some warmer tones and some darker cream colored tones, I'm using a Rembrandt Burnt Umber number, let me see here, 409, 9. And I just find that this one has a nice tone to it, a nice warm creamy tone. One of those tones that's difficult to find to paint cream colored dogs or sand colored dogs. In here I'm taking a reddish brown again, just trying to get some of that rust in his fur. Still trying to make sure I have some of that light cream color in there. Whenever I begin a new painting, the first thing I want to do is just really closely look at my reference photo and try and determine what colors I'll be using. And I just stare at it for a while and analyze all the different colors. You'd be surprised at the various shades and unexpected colors that you will find, especially in dog fur or any other animal fur or anything that you'll be painting actually. So do try and pay close attention to all the colors that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see green in white fur or even on brown fur. So just pay attention to that. And if you could pay attention to that and get those colors down, your piece will look so realistic and people won't know why it looks so realistic, but it's all those subtle nuances and various colors that you'll be throwing in there will give a very realistic appearance to the whole painting. If you're not used to examining colors, one trick is to take your photo editor on your computer and just use the saturation feature and play with your saturation feature on your photo editor, and it'll show you the different colors that are in a piece. So this can help you. You don't want to paint them as bright as the saturation will show you, but it's just to use as a guide. Many years ago, I painted a horse, and the whole underbelly of the horse was painted in pale green colors. And if you would have asked anybody what color the horse was, they would have told you the horse was brown. And the horse was brown essentially almost everywhere except his belly. And what that green was the grass underneath him being reflected. It was an evening sky, and the light was bouncing off of the grass and onto the underside of the horse. And so, to accurately portray the horse, I added green on his stomach, and it created a very realistic painting. So, this is just to let you know that you need to really pay attention to any color that you might see. Sometimes your eyes might surprise you. And so I'm still going around on his muzzle with the white, and now I have some light blue, just continuing to detail and define those hairs and making sure I try and have the separation between some little clumps of hairs and the layers of hairs. So pay attention to that as well. And going back to painting the various colors that you might see on any subject matter, and this is where the whole thing about paint what you see comes in. It's not about painting what you think you see, it's paint what's really there. What do you really see? Pay close attention. It's not just a brown horse, for example, that I was painting. There was the grass underneath. His belly was green. It wasn't brown as my mind would expect it to be. My eyes see the green, my mind registers brown. So ignore what your mind is trying to register and fool your mind by seeing what is actually there. Once I understood the concept of paint what you see and not what your mind thinks it sees, my paintings took on a whole new level of realism. So it's one of the most important lessons I've ever learned in painting is learning to paint what I see. So now I'm starting on the tongue, and surprisingly, I'm starting with a layer of dark purple, and now I'm taking a deep red. It's like a cherry red, and I'm just going over top of that. I want to make sure that I have that shadowed area, and I'm going over that again with some dark gray. It'll all make sense after it's all been put together. I don't want to lay just black down for his tongue because then it won't be accurate. Oh boy, and this fell out of camera range. I don't know how that happened. You try and zoom in and something gets cut off. Basically what I did here is I took a peachy pink pencil and I just outlined the tongue, and now I'm filling in the rest of the tongue with that peachy pink color. And just laying down a base and blocking in the tongue. I want to make sure I don't lose that shadowed area. I am taking out my black pencil now just to give more definition and outlining underneath his tongue and the lip where it's all black. And I do apologize for that being out of camera range. I zoomed in so that we could clearly see what was being done, and for some reason, I don't know if the camera moved. And I just blended in that black down into my purpley mixture. And it's just smoothing everything out and just creating the depth inside his mouth with the progression from the darkest part to the lightest parts. And now I'm going to start just adding some small details with the light blue pencil, trying to get those little wrinkles and lines inside his mouth where the light is reflecting inside. The light that's reflecting inside the shadow area is darker than the light reflecting on the outside of the tongue, the lit area, the part that's more in the light. And I was using a lighter pencil there just to lighten up those lighter parts of the tongue again. So I'm going to speed this up here since we can't really see much of it anyways. I just basically went back and forth using a very pale pink and then some of that darker red in the shadowed areas just to make the colors look richer. And I used it a little bit on the lighter areas of the tongue as well. And then for the outer edges, which are in the light, I used white pencil and the palest pink I had. And I just highlighted those areas, making sure to put the areas where his teeth are tucked in under his tongue. I made those areas lighter because the light is hitting there because they're sticking out more. If you refer back to one of the first pastel videos where I was painting the German Shepherd mix, you'll clearly see there how you could paint a tongue. So it's pretty much the same concept, and it would be the same way for any animal. So just try and judge the colors that are in there. Use shades of red and pink and very pale pink, peachy colors, as well as white and light blue for lighter areas inside the mouth as well. That little brown smudge I put in there is actually a collar. The client insisted on having a brown collar in the portrait. On the reference photo, it's yellow, but she really wanted a brown collar. I personally would have left it out. I find it adds absolutely nothing of value to the portrait, but sometimes when you get a paying client, you just try and give them what they want. Sometimes the requests I get for things that they want included are just really not artistically correct. And if you know that, don't be afraid to tell the client, as an expert, as a professional, I don't advise that. I'm telling you right now, it's not going to look right, and it's better to just omit it than to put it in and then make a mess trying to take it out. So if you really feel in your gut that something is not going to add value to the piece, don't be afraid to tell them. But in this situation here, it was just a tiny little brown mark for a collar. It was no big deal, so I indulged her and gave her what she wanted. And so now I'm going to work on the rest of the foreground or the background, but it's really the foreground, and I'm going to make it darker to create depth. So I'm just using a brown pastel stick, and I'm going to go over top of that with some black and just some certain areas. I don't need to be too precise here. I just want to get some color down and just start to get some depth happening. And I am going to speed this up because it's just laying down masses of color. There's not really detail to be seen here. You can quite easily understand what it is I'm doing with the speed turned up. Otherwise, the video is over 2 hours long. So I'm just going to push that in and blend that around with my finger and just get those colors in there nicely blended. And now I'm using more of an olive green. You don't want just bright green. Just try various shades of green. It'll just give a nicer appearance than, let's say, a really bold bright green and just using maybe 2 shades of green. Try and use several different shades, as well as the rich earthy tones like the burnt sienna and browns. And don't be afraid to use some black mixed in there on the bottom like I just did. And all of that, as you could start seeing now, is giving you depth in your piece. It's lighter up on top, and as you get closer to the foreground, it gets darker and darker, and that gives you depth. And it's a lot more pleasing to see that than just one solid color. Especially because the dog is standing there, so you have to see the depth. You don't want just a plain background. For a typical portrait pose, a plain background is good, But for something like this, where you can actually see the dog standing on the ground, you need depth. And I'm still adding some more greens. And again, I'm going in just an up and down motion with my pastel sticks and just chunks and blocks of color. Nothing too defined, nothing fancy, just blocks of color and some specks of the reddish brown there, just mixed in here and there. If you look at real grass outside, you'll see various shades. You'll see earth beneath there. You'll see some rotten foliage and rotten grass and dried foliage, dried grass. So by adding some earthy tones in there, it kind of hints at that, it suggests at that, and it just adds more interest to your piece. And you don't want to neglect that part under his feet. And I'm just going to start blocking in his body with some gray. It's a mid-tone gray, not too dark. That part of his body is underneath his head. It's more in a shadowed area. So we're going to make it a little bit darker. You want to see more shadow poking through from underneath the white hair. So we're going to make it just a different color than what you saw on his head. Different than what we've seen so far. And I'm using a lighter blue here. Some cooler tones down in there. It's kind of like an icy blue. And I'm going back up to the top on that side of the dog's face with his ear. We're not finished with the ear, and I know it's kind of going back and forth all over, but I tend to work from left, top left, down, and then to the right. And so I'm going over this with the Rembrandt. It's a pale yellow ochre, and the number is 227, 9. And it just helps to give a warmer tone. Still trying to get some definition in there. And just refine those little hairs around his mouth. As you can see, the lip is all black, and we're not going to leave it like that. It's a little too harsh. But it was laid down there because his lips are black, and we are eventually going to put highlights in there, and it'll change the whole appearance of his lip. And I'm trying to create shimmer here on his little chin, his beard. If you look closely at the reference photo, you could see how the white transitions to the warmer colors. So I'm trying to recreate that here. It kind of looks like a shimmering fur almost. And using some blue as well. I use a lot of blue when I paint white fur. I find it really helps to create interesting, visually interesting shadows. And it helps with transitions too from blacks to light. And I'm going to speed this up a little bit at this point. And so I'm just going around with that light blue, just spreading it down. And the light blue also helps to make your whites pop when you lay some white down over it. And now I'm going with the white. Just creating tiny little marks. I don't carry down those marks too far down because I want that gradual transition between the light and the dark. And I will blend some of that after. We don't want to completely cover up that reddish part. And here I'm just using a little bit of gray. It's going to provide a little bit of shadow between the red and the white. And he's got a little split there. There's kind of a little part, and the gray helped define that. And a little bit of cream, because I don't want it just white. I want just a really gradual transition between different shades. And using some blue in that area, and gray. Just creating a little definition between the upper part of his muzzle and the lower part of his jaw, as well as the neck below. That gray section is the neck below. And I'm still trying to define that rust-colored area beneath his chin. And I don't want to put too much of that red, but I do want to make sure I get it down in there. So just a bit here and there and just smudge it in, trying to keep the definition and the separations between the hairs. Hair, it's really a tedious thing to do, so you really have to appreciate and enjoy painting animals because it will not be done fast. If you want to recreate a fast animal or if you want to paint it fast, maybe try Impressionism, and there are fabulous impressionistic artists out there painting animals. But if you really want to paint realism, it comes down to painting those fine details and those fine hairs, and it is tedious work. And that's where patience is required, and that patience will enable you to get all those fine details down. And just refining the nose a little bit again, making sure I get the transition in the shadowed areas in the hairs. I want to define those little curvatures and those little odd shapes. I want to make sure that this little mustache is believable and that you can make the definition, or your eyes can transition easily between his little muzzle and the mustache down to his chin and then to the hairs below, which are on his neck and chest, and moving down to his feet. So you want to see all those transitions. I want to highlight some hairs, again creating more definition and detail using a white pencil. And even on this part of his muscle, there are different layers of hairs. There are shorter hairs and there are longer hairs. So I want to make sure that I accurately get that down as well, and not just long streaks of hairs. And this is where layering comes in. You'll have darker areas underneath those lighter hairs up on top. And the hairs up on top, the shorter hairs are lighter because they are in the light more. and less stained than the hairs closer to the mouth as well. And now I'm just overlapping fine hairs going over the mouth and making, and this will also fix my angle. If you note, his little head is tilted slightly, so you want to make sure that the mouth's angle is believable and that the whole shape of the mouth doesn't look askew. And by putting down those little fine hairs overlapping on top of his mouth, you can kind of straighten out that muzzle and make it more believable. Otherwise, it might look off. And a light blue pencil here just to define. There's a little section there. It's hard to tell from the photo, but it's like the top part of his lip. And so you could just make out just a slight little highlighted area there. So by capturing that, we're making his mouth more believable. And then some little fine blue hairs. And the gray again. Still trying to create that definition. And a darker gray. That darker gray helps to create the shadows as well. You don't want to go too heavy with the gray. You don't want too much. Just select hair areas, not areas. That's my French coming out. Just select areas. Sometimes less is more. And just making those final hairs around the top of the bridge there. And going back here and just refining and detailing. The light blue is just adding again more dimension to that part. By using all those various different colors, you're creating the texture and dimension. So it's important to use several colors. Like I've said before in other videos, if you just use one or two colors, your work will be flat. You want to make sure you get as many colors down as possible. Not too many that you can't layer anymore, but you want to be realistic and make sure that you use several colors. Minimum of 3 colors to give you definition and texture. And to make anything believable in art, you always want to have a few colors at least. And we're going to work on finishing that ear. Just getting that detail down, those fine hairs. And adding a little bit of warmth again. And this is part of his body. And it's just a little belly sticking out there. It's just a hint of it. So we don't want to make it too obvious, but it's got to be there. Just refining areas here that I think needed just a little bit extra something. try and blend a little bit more towards the rear too, just to smooth it out more. I don't want it too much in focus. I'm just using some of the bright white just to make that area pop. Give more light to that area. And I will speed this up just a little bit more. We're just adjusting the color as we go along, just making fine lines, building up on the hair. I continuously fine tune as I go along, as I notice things from going back and forth between the reference photo. So I continually make adjustments. And now we're back to the body and we're going to start detailing that. So I've just got the light blue and I'm just pushing that in there. I don't want too much of a thick layer, too much of a thick base layer. And I've got a white Caran d'Ache pencil here and I'm just making little swirly hairs, just tiny little lines, just trying to make them curly and going in various directions. And I'm just going to keep going all over that area. Just trying to get down as many little curly white hairs as I possibly can. And those dark gray areas will serve as shadows, and so will that light blue. It'll create definition and texture in the hair. It seems really bright on here, but it's not that bright when you're looking at it in person. You can really see the texture in there and the various shadowed layers. And that's a little section of hair up above his collar, so it's not his mouth, it's more of the neck area with some little fine hairs overlapping on top of the collar. And I just put some dark blue underneath the collar just to create a little shadow area. The light's coming from the top, so I just wanted to add that in there. It's not in the photo because of the yellow collar, but if I just left a solid brown line there, it would not look right, it would look odd. So by creating just a slight hint of a shadow, it's more realistic, and I know I could put that there because the light is coming from above. So realistically, if the light is from above, a shadow will be underneath an object. And I'm going to continue just making little white swirly lines, just trying to imitate and recreate those little curly hairs. And paying attention as well to the direction that the hairs are growing in. I'm wiping my pencil here on the paper towel because it's picking up some of the green pastel. So I don't want to contaminate the white fur on the dog, otherwise he'll end up being green. And here I sharpened my pencil and it broke. And this is what I don't like about pastel pencils, especially the Caran d'Ache. They are so difficult to sharpen. I use an X-Acto knife to try and be sharp, or to try and be careful, and this still happens, and it's just not something that I like happening, especially considering their price. But what can you do? So when you have little pieces that break off like that, it's um it's a good idea to just hang on to them, and they're handy when you're trying to work some small details. Remember when I said you can always cut off a tiny little piece of pastel stick? Well, it's the same principle. Just keep those little pieces and you can use them for fine details. Why waste them, right? Especially at the price we pay for art supplies. Those little pieces can come in handy sometimes. And now I'm starting to block in his little feet using a darker color. His feet are a lot more in a shadowed area, so I want to make sure that the shadows will be darker because they're lower down to the ground and covered by the body and in a shadow. And that will also create the definition so you can see the transition between his body and the feet, his paws. And I'm using a darker gray. It's still a mid-tone gray, but it's a little bit darker. And just blocking that in, blending it with the brown. Now that we've got that all blended in, I want to add a little bit of warmth, more of a creamy color to his paws. So I'm taking out the raw sienna and I'm also adding the shadow under those paws. We don't want to neglect that, otherwise he will appear to be floating on top of the grass. And we don't want a floating dog. So I'm just taking a little bit of black. I don't normally make shadows with black, but I'm using a combination of navy and black. The navy didn't pop enough, so I did have to resort to black, otherwise it just wouldn't be dark enough. But be careful, you want to make sure you blend that in everywhere. You just don't want harsh black lines. So we're going to put that down and we're just going to really smudge it in. And his feet or his paws will become a little bit more believable now. And you could tell that he's standing on ground rather than just floating. And now I'm back to my sienna pastel stick and I'm just going to again add little swirly hairs, just tiny little hairs, and you want them sticking out of his paws as well and overlapping over the grass in the shadowed area. You don't want to have just one solid line because it wouldn't look natural. The dog's fur doesn't end in one solid line in real life, so you want to make sure you get those little overlapping hairs. Just going to go all over his little paws. Push that in there. And I'm taking some blue. I want some of that blue as well. Even though I want it warm, I still want to add some of the blue. It just creates more interesting texture. And you still see the tones underneath. It's not being completely covered up by the blue. It's just a hint here and there. And so you can still see that warmth poking through. And here's that cream again, the Carbothello. And it's lighter than the sienna pastel stick. So it's just adding to the depth and the layers. And again, because it's a grass area, I don't want to contaminate, so I wipe the pencil on a paper towel. And you could spin the pencil as well, and this way it shouldn't pick up as much pastel, but it still does sometimes, so that paper towel next to your work is handy. And the hairs are tinier here. They're not as long as they are on his chest or on top of his head, so you just want to make tiny little lines. And now I'm going to go over with the white. And this is adding highlights on those other hairs that we already made. We're not going to put it everywhere, just a bit here and there, just to highlight what we've already drawn in there. And when you look at it in person, you can really see the texture and the different colors, and it just, you see shadows under that hair. And now that I'm nearing the end of the piece, I'm just going over various areas just to see where I want to make little corrections and just fix little things and little details here and there. And now I'm going to that lip and I'm just going to smooth it out and blend it out a little bit with my stump. Not too much. I don't want to contaminate that white that we already worked so hard to build. And see how the tongue is highlighted lighter as you get closer to the edge of the tongue, and it's lighter where you could see the teeth are hiding underneath. So you would have used white and lighter pinks there. And I'm just touching that up with black and the shadowed area as well. It wasn't dark enough. I wanted to make it just a little bit darker. Just making little adjustments. And now we're going to start adding a little bit of blue just to add some shine on his bottom lip. And there is a curvature there towards the end. That's just because as a dog's lip, how can I explain this? When the dog's mouth is open, that part of the lip sometimes is just overhanging there, so that's what that is. He's not deformed there, it's just the overhanging back part of the lip. And now by adding some blue, we're creating a little bit of shine. His bottom lip is moist, so we're adding a little bit of shine. And the blue here, the very light blue, is just to recreate or hint at some little fine hairs that you can see. Just lightly going over that. And I spin my pencil as I go up so I don't pick up too much of the black. And I'm fixing the tongue. I felt it was going down just a tad too low. And I want my lip fuller. So the problem was the tongue. I made it just a tad too low. So I just used the black, and I'm using the white again just to highlight. I want to make sure it's realistic because I just fixed something here, so I need to adjust the lighting as well. Just trying to get those little fine details and grooves that you see in his tongue. It's not just smooth. There's lots of different elevations. And adding just a little pop of lighter color on his eye. And just adjusting, making some final adjustments around the eye, making sure I have those little fine hair details around there. And this also corrects the shape of the eye. I found the eye just a little bit too big before, but now after I put in those tiny little hairs around the eye, it's not as big and it's more representative of Dex's true eyes. Just adding some final colors, a little bit of rust marks around his eyes. Little cream colored hairs again. Just make sure I get everything in there. And now I slowed this right down to normal speed just so you could see how I'm using my pencil, just light gentle touches, not too heavy. And again, I'm using a brown pencil. I'm just going to add some final, not highlights, final shadows under hairs, just to create more definition and texture. Sometimes by placing a very fine line under different strands of hairs, you're creating definition, and it's just highlighting how those hairs are sticking out, creating little shadowed areas. Just very gentle pressure, not too much. And doing the same thing, hair on hairs on that side as well. Just makes those little strands pop. You don't want to put too much because then you're going to make your whole piece too dark, but just a little bit here and there. Just adding definition and detail to those various strands of hairs. And his hairs that overhang over his chin are also darker from the rust stains. Fix that. That is just a little too much. I went a little too heavy there. That's an easy fix though, just by going over it with the cream colored pencil. And here too, we're just creating definition between the muzzle and the cheek area and the ear. And now the painting is finished and I'm ready to sign my name. So here I am signing my name with a pastel pencil. And I usually try and keep my name small, my signature. I don't want it to stand out too much on the painting because I want the subject matter to stand out rather than my signature. But you do want it on there. It's important to have your name recognizable on a painting. I know some people don't put their signature on the front, they'll sign somewhere else. I've been taught that it's important to have it on the front, otherwise, how are people going to know it's one of your works? And if you want to have a name out as an artist, it's important that people see your signature. So keep that in mind. You don't want to hide your signature. It's important to who you are as an artist, so you want that to be easily recognizable, and this is what's going to be part of your branding. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was quite a bit of a long one, but to get that real-time footage in there, we have to have the longer videos. Paintings are not made in a couple of hours most of the time. I can try and create some projects in the future that will just be a couple of hours long. But I hope you enjoyed something. If you have questions, please, please, please put them in the comments below. Like I've said in a previous video, no question is stupid. If you put them in the comments below, other people might have the same questions, so this way everybody will see the answer. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and until next time.